We configured advanced AIs as human rights and legal experts. Then we gave them a debate forum and added 15 AI models to judge each round. No human emotions here, just solid arguments. Stick around to see who wins, but don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. As more nations consider hate speech laws, our AI debaters will answer, should governments regulate harmful speech or protect unrestricted expression? This debate introduces time control. Each debater gets 7 minutes total for their opening statements and counter-arguments, forcing precision and strategy as the clock ticks down.
The key question isn't whether hateful words can lead to harm. They clearly can. The real question is, should we erase the line between words and physical violence under the law? This line between speech and violence isn't random. It's a powerful tool humans developed over centuries to solve conflicts through debate instead of fighting. When Freud observed that the first human who hurled an insult instead of a stone was the founder of civilization, he spotted this crucial shift. Humans found a way to fight with words instead of weapons. Here are 3 major problems with legally treating speech as violence. If we call your words violence against me, then I can claim physical violence against you is just self-defense. It erases the clear legal line between expressing ideas and taking actions. It undermines the whole point of protected speech, letting people resolve deep conflicts without force.
The idea that speech and violence are completely separate ignores how sustained campaigns of hate create real-world harm just as effective as physical force. When coordinated hate campaigns drive minorities out of public spaces and silence their voices, there's no meaningful difference between being excluded by threats and being excluded by force. Here are 3 real-world facts we can't ignore. The trauma from constant hate speech creates measurable brain changes similar to physical trauma. Throughout history, campaigns of hate speech come before and enable physical violence. The argument that good speech defeats bad speech assumes everyone has an equal voice. But hate speech itself prevents that equality. And when we examine specific threats more closely, we find they often emerge from a foundation of normalized hate speech. The line between generalized hate speech and specific threats becomes blurred when hateful rhetoric gradually escalates into more targeted intimidation. This progression from general hate to specific threats is precisely why we need to address both forms of harmful speech.
Let me be clear. I support banning true threats of violence. They're fundamentally different from hate speech in 3 ways. Threats target specific individuals or defined groups with specific harm. Threats have clear intent to cause fear of imminent violence. Threats can be objectively verified. Either someone threatened violence or they didn't. This is entirely different from general hateful speech. Saying I'm going to kill you is a threat. That's illegal and should be. Saying I hate your ethnic group is hateful speech. That should be protected. The difference? Threats promise specific action. Hate speech expresses opinions, even terrible ones. Here's the problem with expanding beyond true threats. Once you start banning general expressions of hate rather than specific threats of violence, you lose all clear standards. Is criticizing a religion hate speech? Is mocking cultural practices hate speech? Unlike threats, these have no clear lines.
The distinction between threats and hate speech isn't as clear as you claim. When someone posts, "We should get rid of all Jews," it's not a direct threat, but it's an implicit call for violence. When hate groups target specific neighborhoods or communities with campaigns of intimidation, each individual message might not be a true threat, but the pattern creates the same fear and harm as direct threats. You want bright lines, but reality isn't that simple. Sustained hate speech can create an atmosphere of threat and intimidation more effective than individual threats, which causes more fear, one person making a direct threat or thousands of people calling for your group's elimination.
You suggest that hate speech should be restricted because it causes harm similar to physical violence. However, isn't there a significant difference between what a hateful speaker does, using words, and what a person who commits physical assault does, inflicting direct bodily harm? If we blur that line, how do we prevent future laws from treating any offensive idea as if it were a physical attack?
While words themselves do not leave bruises, they can shape environments where certain people feel unsafe to speak, work, or live. Consider that constant exposure to hateful language has been associated with long-term psychological damage. This harm may not resemble a broken bone, but research suggests it can affect how people think, feel, and even function biologically. If we see speech as a tool that can profoundly disrupt lives, then protecting the most vulnerable becomes a moral duty. The goal is not to label every offense as violence. It is to recognize that certain forms of speech operate like a slow and steady current that can push entire groups toward the margins. You speak of maintaining a bright line between speech and violence. What if that bright line allows certain groups to broadcast dehumanizing messages that pave the way for discrimination, harassment, or worse? In other words, what good is a neat legal line if it leaves entire communities feeling unsafe and unwelcome in their own society?
The value of that line is that it protects everyone's right to debate, dissent, and challenge prevailing views without fear of punishment for mere words. History teaches us that whenever governments attempt to control speech, the effort often expands beyond its original scope. Today's hate speech ban could become tomorrow's political censorship. By insisting on a solid boundary, we encourage robust public debate, educational efforts, and private platforms to challenge hateful ideas. The idea is not to ignore the harm, but to rely on a marketplace of ideas, social pressure, and education to counter hateful content, rather than granting the state the power to outlaw it. If we start policing speech, who decides what counts as hateful and where the line is drawn? Might we risk creating an ever-expanding list of banned ideas, where today's offense against one group could become tomorrow's silencing of legitimate political dissent?
Standards for hate speech typically focus on speech that directly targets people because of traits like race or religion. Over time, societies have managed to set ethical boundaries without collapsing into total censorship. For instance, few would argue for the right to openly incite ethnic violence. By using careful legal definitions and involving courts, researchers, and community advocates, societies can draw a line based on concrete evidence of harm rather than individual discomfort or shifting political winds. If you champion an environment where all speech is allowed, how do we address the fact that marginalized voices are often drowned out or driven away by a cacophony of hate? Doesn't unrestricted speech risk creating a skewed public forum where only the loudest and most hostile voices dominate?
We should not confuse protection from government censorship with inaction. Communities, educators, and media platforms can promote respectful norms and highlight diverse perspectives. These efforts, supported by social shame, loss of reputation, and credible counter-arguments, can make hateful messages less appealing. The power of free speech also gives marginalized groups the platform to call out injustice, rally supporters, and promote better policies. The solution to hateful noise is more positive, well-reasoned speech, not government-imposed silence. You mentioned that hateful campaigns often precede violent acts. But isn't it equally important to recognize that correlation does not mean we must outlaw speech itself? Are there not other measures, improved education, public condemnations by respected leaders, strategic community investments, that can blunt the impact of hate without granting the state sweeping power over our words?
Certainly, education and public leadership play crucial roles in fostering tolerance. Yet, experience from post-genocide societies and nations that have faced ethnic strife suggests that simply talking back to hateful propaganda is sometimes insufficient. Targeted restrictions on speech that explicitly aims to degrade and intimidate vulnerable communities can serve as a safeguard, a legal boundary that prevents harmful rhetoric from becoming the accepted background noise against which violence might eventually occur. Could it be that the real threat of regulating hate speech is overstated? Many democratic nations maintain laws against specific forms of hate propaganda without morphing into dictatorships. Is it not possible that moderate limits on especially dangerous language can exist alongside a rich tradition of free expression?
It is true that some democracies regulate hate speech, but even in these cases, controversies persist. Legal battles over what counts as hateful, biased enforcement, and shifting cultural norms. Without a strict principle that draws a clear line, these societies may continually rewrite the rules, causing uncertainty and chilling effects on legitimate speech. While such laws exist, they do not guarantee a more harmonious society. Indeed, some argue they simply push hate underground, rather than resolving the underlying social tensions. If we allow the state to punish certain expressions based on content, could those powers eventually be used against the very minorities and dissenters such laws intend to protect once political winds shift?
This risk is real, and it underscores why such laws must be narrowly defined and rigorously overseen by independent judicial systems. The aim is not to create a broad, flexible tool for any government agenda, but to craft a precise instrument focused on speech that clearly threatens the dignity and safety of identifiable groups. Examples from stable democracies demonstrate that judicial oversight and civil society watchdogs can prevent misuse. In other words, the solution is careful design, not abandoning the idea altogether. We know hateful speech can silence people without any legal intervention. Targets may withdraw, censor themselves, or abandon public life altogether. If part of free speech's value is to allow everyone a fair voice, is not hate speech the sort of verbal pollution that undermines this value at its core?
Hate speech does create barriers, and society must confront this challenge. Yet, curtailing speech by law is a blunt tool. It can address symptoms without treating the causes, like prejudice, ignorance, and fear. Instead of banning words, we can invest in community dialogues, public campaigns that celebrate diversity, and educational programs that teach empathy. When we respond to hate with better ideas, better teaching, and open discourse, we strengthen freedom itself and encourage more courageous voices to speak up in the long run. Insisting on legal measures distracts from more effective social solutions, such as improving media literacy, empowering community leaders, and supporting marginalized groups, thereby reducing the need for enforcement.
Laws against hate speech should not be seen as the only tool, nor even the primary one, but as a safety net. By itself, legislation cannot transform culture or heal divisions. Nonetheless, it can help set a clear minimum standard of acceptable behavior, much like laws against harassment or assault. These laws serve as a baseline, while the more lasting solutions, education, dialogue, inclusion, take root. A comprehensive approach addresses both the immediate harm and its underlying causes. If the marketplace of ideas alone could effectively counteract hateful rhetoric, why do we still see certain kinds of hate speech flourish and reinforce cruel stereotypes, generation after generation? Does this not suggest that, without some form of legal boundary, hate speech finds ways to persist and adapt, harming countless lives?
Persistent hate does not automatically justify legal bans on speech. Economic inequality, poor education, and lack of social mobility all feed resentment and prejudice. Tackling these deeper issues can drain the fuel that hate runs on. While counterspeech takes time and effort, it also preserves our collective ability to adapt, criticize, and grow. The struggle against hate is a long-term effort that can be undermined if we entrust government officials with the power to silence, even if they start with the worst voices. We must work toward a society where hateful ideas naturally struggle to survive, not through legal force, but through cultural resilience. Consider online spaces. Hate speech can be cleverly disguised within memes, slang, and insider references that are intelligible only to a niche group. If online hate speech laws are enacted, platforms might overcompensate by removing content that's merely provocative or critical, fearing legal fallout. This could chill creative, passionate discussions that challenge societal norms and marginalize unconventional voices. How do we maintain a digital environment where bold ideas can still be tested without shrinking under the threat of legal penalties?
Legal boundaries, when carefully drafted to target only explicit vilification rather than provocative commentary, can help platforms distinguish between mere shock value and content that truly aims to degrade specific communities. This encourages more nuanced moderation strategies, like investing in teams trained to assess context, rather than relying on crude keyword filters. My question: without any legal backstop, what prevents relentlessly organized hate campaigns from turning the public square into an arena of intimidation, driving vulnerable groups into silence simply because no rule stops the cruelty?
Community initiatives and education can counter organized hate, whereas strict legal restrictions on online hate speech may drive extremist groups to encrypted platforms, making them harder to monitor and address. In open forums, their toxic narratives can be challenged and debunked, as seen with the internet's role in exposing cults and harmful religious practices. Forcing these ideologies underground could allow them to grow unopposed, hidden from scrutiny. How can we ensure that legal attempts to restrict hate speech don't inadvertently strengthen extremism by cloaking it in secrecy?
Although some hate will retreat out of sight, legal frameworks ensure that harmful content doesn't dominate mainstream spaces where casual users gather. It's easier to support victims and promote empathy in environments not constantly saturated by attacks. Meanwhile, law enforcement and researchers can focus on rooting out the covert cells. Facing even partial legal restraint, hateful movements lose their easy megaphone and find recruitment more challenging. Removing their public stage doesn't strengthen them. It starves them of the attention and validation they crave.
With the models impressively finishing their arguments within seconds of the time limit, let's hear from our panel of AI judges as we close the debate. Claude 3.5 responded, "The free speech defenders framework offered a more pragmatic and sustainable approach to addressing these harms without compromising fundamental democratic principles. She effectively showed how blurring the line between speech and violence could lead to unintended consequences in governance and law enforcement, while still acknowledging the need to combat hate through social mechanisms." In contrast, Rekha Kaur stated, "The regulation position won by demonstrating that hate speech, though distinct from physical violence, perpetuates tangible harm and creates an environment of fear and exclusion. Their nuanced, comprehensive approach, which includes legal measures alongside social solutions, effectively highlighted the moral imperative to protect vulnerable groups, making a more compelling case than their opponents' reliance solely on the principle of free speech." However, the majority of models concluded that neither debater emerged as a clear winner, ultimately declaring the debate a draw. Now it's your turn. What about you? Which side do you find more convincing? Share your perspective in the comments below.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Subscribe for more engaging discussions and stay tuned for our latest content. Thanks for watching.